We'll now hear from the former National Lead for Mathematics at Ofsted. Jane was an HMI who was a valued member of the maths education community and was always very pleased to enter into the conversation and debate with teachers. We're looking forward to hearing what she has to say on the relationship between the curriculum and the assessment now that she's not centre stage. Jane, please can you come up? Thank you.
It's been great to be invited, thank you very much. One thing I would like to say just about my former role, I don't think I stood on a platform ever as an HMI and said anything about mathematics that I didn't believe. So I don't think you'll hear me saying different things today. Anyway, right, making the most, I thought as Andy so very well talked about high-stakes assessments, I would do the opposite. So I think this is not an opposing view, this is a complementary view. I've got a clicky thing, so I'm going to click on the clicky thing. And what I mean by low stakes are the sort of formative assessment that you can get in the classroom, and possibly somewhere between the two, between low stakes and high stakes, would be the sort of tests that happen in schools. And in different schools, those might be high stakes, because teachers' performance management might depend on them and that sort of thing. But I want to look at the sort of breadth of those, because I think there's a lot of potential in those that I don't think we're exploiting. And if the project that Lynn and her team are leading could help to support the potential of those low-stake assessments, I think that would improve both teaching and the curriculum, I think, in terms of its delivery. It's interesting that the work on the curriculum, devising our national curricula over the years, I think people have always been, who've been involved in that work, have always been told not to do anything on assessment, to keep assessment separate. I'm sure that's been the case for at least the last two. In the days of the Rose Review as well, which never really got anywhere, that was also separate, assessment was separate. And I think it's very important to think about the two hand in hand. Anyway, that's just my view. That's not an Ofsted formal view, okay? Right, so why should we assess? It might be one of the questions a teacher might ask. Why might we assess? What do we assess? How could we assess? And what happens as a result? Those are some of the things I want to think about. So my premise is that the reason we assess, that teachers assess, is to find out how well pupils are learning. I think that's probably one of the top things. I don't think it's about teacher performance, I think it's about finding out how well pupils are learning. What might we assess? This is where I think one of the issues currently lies. At the moment, I think the emphasis is on proficiency, it's on knowledge. There is some emphasis on problem solving, but it's not always a good quality problem solving. And the least emphasis, I think, is on reasoning in terms of assessment. You might differ. You can have discussion time in a moment or three. I picked out a few key stage 2 test questions, again, to contrast with Andy's GCSE. These are taken from papers 2 and 3, which are called reasoning. And when I was looking through them and thinking about my input today, I was thinking, well, how much of that reasoning is what I would count as reasoning? Now, I think reasoning as an aim of the national curriculum is probably the most important one, because I think reasoning underpins conceptual understanding. If you're going to understand something, you need to be able to reason about it, or because you can reason about it, you show you can understand it. They sort of go hand in hand. But also, if you're going to problem solve, that's about reasoning. So I think both the other two aims, the conceptual understanding part of fluency and also the problem-solving element, both depend on reasoning. So reasoning, I think, bridges both of those two and underpins both of those two. So these three questions came from the two papers, but when I looked through the papers, the vast majority of questions were what I would call problem-solving questions. So that the marks that were given to reasoning, I think, were the problem-solving side of reasoning, and not questions that might look at the structure of what's happening mathematically. Now, in terms of my former job up until the end of January, and the evidence that we gathered in Ofsted, reasoning is the weakest of the three national curriculum aims. It's the things that teachers find most difficult to develop. And part of that, I think, is because you need to have really good subject knowledge to develop pupils' reasoning, to know what to say, to know what tasks and activities to give, to pick up on the clues and react. So I was interested that there were so few questions on the Key Stage 2 papers, and I'm very happy to go back on the Key Stage 2 test review group if anybody's got any influence. I used to be on it. You know, so that I think we could have more questions that link into the structure, because that sends a message about how important it is to reason about the structures and relationships in mathematics. Okay, so how might we do these low-stake assessments? So what sort of mechanisms are there in place in the classroom? Well, I remember using a phrase, teacher as detective. So the teacher as detective in the classroom. The teacher can pick up clues by going around listening to what pupils are saying, looking at what they're doing, listening into what they're saying to each other, as well as what they are communicating with the teacher. It shows in what they perhaps do in their written work, in their classwork, in their homework, in their practical activity, in their problem solving. All sorts of clues that the teacher can pick up on and act on. What do the pupils talk about? They answer teachers' questions. Often they're asked to explain, and explanations are usually about how I did it, not why what I've chosen to do is you know, what's the structure, what's the reasoning behind why I've chosen how to do something. Sometimes pupils will ask questions. Wonderful to hear pupils asking questions, not just, I'm stuck, can you help type of questions, but actually, sometimes you get pupils asking something that takes, and a really skilled teacher can take it on and take it forwards. So there's that as well. And then in discussions. So all sorts of communication things. Notice most of those aren't formal in any sense, and a lot of them aren't even written down. But they are where the assessment, I think there's potential for sort of milking that assessment. What happens next? Now, this is where I get a bee in my bonnet. Crucially, the clues that the teacher picks up in the classroom, I believe, should then inform how the teaching then moves on. So according to what those clues are, the teacher then makes decisions about how the teaching's adapted. So if there's a misconception that arises, then the teaching should be adapted in order to tackle that misconception. If it's, say, assessment through marking homework, then what's the next steps for the teaching? You know, the purpose for marking work, yes, okay, give feedback to teachers, but really, I think that one of the most important things for marking homework or marking classwork is to inform the future teaching. And which pupils do I need to challenge more? And which pupils do I need to give some support to? And where are we going to get the intervention, etc., etc. The second bullet point there goes even further, because I think in terms of marking written work, teachers are quite skilled at identifying which pupils need intervention, which pupils need support. I think it's far too rare that teachers and leaders in particular, subject leaders and senior leaders, sit back and think, what's this assessment, informal or formal, whichever you want to call it, what's it telling us about how well pupils are learning? What do we need to do, or what could we do to support teachers so that actually the teaching approach enables better learning? What do we need to do in terms of our curriculum documents to support teachers so perhaps the teaching approach is a better one? So can we be strategic about how we use the outcomes of those written assessments? Okay, now this one, I don't know if you can read that one. I used previously, assessment, I think, should be an integral part of teaching and of learning. And I don't think it is. Now, this list is not definitive. This was me just thinking, where does assessment come into teaching? And it comes in the before. Where's the pre-learning? What do they need to know? What do they ideally need to know so that I know they're ready to learn what it is I want to teach? And how am I going to weave that into my planning? How am I going to teach it? What's my teaching strategy going to be? How I teach a topic to one class will be different to how I teach it to another class, because I know my classes. I'm not going to avoid misconceptions. I can get really rich learning from misconceptions, so avoiding them or telling pupils where it goes wrong, usually, is not a good idea, because if you tell them where it goes wrong, they usually go wrong, and if you avoid it, they go wrong, but they don't know why they've gone wrong, because they've not had a chance to address it. how to capitalise on learning points. What might arise that I can then capitalise on? During the lessons, we've talked about that already. And then after the lessons, thinking back, how did it go? You know, might want the intervention. Seeing Craig sitting there, I know he's going to pick me up on QLA, but that fitted better on the page. But thinking about what has any assessment, any written assessment, told me in terms of teaching approaches, pupils learning, what I need to do next. So I think there's a sort of longevity across, you know, the assessment goes into all of that. So my final thoughts, I'm almost ahead of time here. This is scary, scary. Right, these are the things that I thought perhaps are most important. I mean, to go back to the original question, I suppose I might be accused of not answering the original question. I think, Lynn, with due respect, it's a loaded question because I think the answer that might come out is that assessment impedes the curriculum. So I think it's a bit loaded, really. So what I've tried to tackle here is the opportunities for assessment to enhance teaching and to enhance the curriculum. Now, the big buts. In any assessment, so much depends on the quality of the assessment, the richness of the assessment, and how teachers use it. And that, in turn, as I've written there, depends on teachers' subject knowledge and their pedagogic knowledge. And I'm not just thinking GCSE, I'm thinking across the age spectrum. And we've got an awful lot of pupils in this country taught by people who are not strong mathematicians. You know, and if I had to go and teach French or history, I wouldn't be a strong French or history teacher. I would need support and help in that. So we've got a real job to do in terms of supporting teachers' subject and pedagogic knowledge, in terms of helping them with these assessments. And then the second thing that I really care about is the assessment. How does it reflect the whole curriculum? Because the whole curriculum is not about the stuff on the pages of stuff. It's about the aims of the curriculum. It's about equipping pupils for their future learning and their future lives mathematically. And I'm not talking about just being engineers. I'm talking about being able to think mathematically and reason mathematically. So mathematics for mathematics' sake, as well as equipping them for their futures so that they can use mathematics as well. So the assessments we tend to see do not cover the whole of the curriculum, and somehow we've got to get better at making the most of informal assessments so that it covers the whole curriculum, because that will make teaching and learning better. 0. Ding. Done. Thank you.